Racist cop arrests black woman for no reason. 7 minutes later, karma hits him hard. The warm afternoon sun drenched the quiet suburban street, glinting off the reflective surface of Officer Daniel Carter's patrol car. Carter had spotted the car a few blocks back. It wasn't speeding or weaving, it moved with precision, almost too perfectly for his liking. Something about the way it glided down the road put him on edge. He flipped on his lights and siren, watching as the sedan immediately slowed and pulled over. No hesitation, no sign of panic. That calm compliance didn't sit well with him. He adjusted his utility belt and stepped out, his boots crunching on the asphalt. His presence alone, the stiff posture, the mirrored sunglasses reflecting the world back to itself, was meant to exude authority. As he approached the car, he took a moment to glance through the rear window. The interior was pristine, spotless, with no clutter or signs of anything out of the ordinary. It irritated him. The driver's window lowered smoothly, revealing a woman sitting upright, her hands resting lightly on the wheel. Her dark skin glowed under the sun's glare, and her face was calm, almost serene. She was dressed in professional attire, a crisp white blouse and tailored navy slacks. Carter noticed her wedding ring glinting as she placed her hand on the window frame. "License and registration," he said gruffly, his tone sharp but not overly aggressive. The woman nodded without a word, opening the glove compartment with deliberate care. She pulled out a neatly folded packet of documents and handed them over. There was no fumbling or rush, no trembling hands, just a smooth efficiency that annoyed Carter more than it should have. Most drivers fumbled. Most avoided eye contact. She didn't. He glanced down at the license. "Naomi Wright," he read aloud, the name rolling off his tongue with an air of skepticism. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Naomi tilted her head slightly, her eyes meeting his with a composed steadiness. "No, officer, I don't." Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. He hated that tone. Too polite, too self-assured. "You failed to signal before turning onto Ashford," he said, though he hadn't actually seen anything wrong with her driving. He didn't need a real reason. Naomi blinked once, her expression unchanging. "I'm certain I signaled," she said softly. "Perhaps you didn't see it." The corner of Carter's mouth twitched, the hint of a smirk forming. He leaned slightly closer, his presence looming. "Are you calling me a liar?" "Not at all," Naomi replied evenly. "I'm simply stating that I believe I followed the rules of the road." Her calmness grated on him. Most people apologized, stumbled over themselves to appease him. She didn't. He straightened up, slipping her license and registration into his pocket. "Step out of the vehicle," he barked, taking a half step back. Naomi hesitated briefly, her hands resting on the wheel. Her gaze lingered on him, as though weighing her options. Then, with the same deliberate calm, she unbuckled her seatbelt and pushed the door open. She stepped out, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. Standing straight, she was taller than Carter expected, her posture unwavering. She crossed her arms lightly in front of her, waiting. "Turn around," Carter said, gesturing toward the hood of her car. "Hands on the vehicle." Naomi's jaw tightened for the briefest moment, but she complied, placing her palms flat on the cool metal surface. Carter moved closer, his hands patting her down in a way that felt more invasive than necessary. His fingers lingered a second too long, searching for something that wasn't there. "What's in the car?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Any drugs? Weapons?" Naomi turned her head slightly, her calm eyes meeting his. "Nothing illegal, officer." Carter didn't like her tone. Not defensive, not panicked, just factual. It felt like a subtle challenge. He stepped back, pulling out his radio. "Unit 5, traffic stop on Elmwood Drive," he said, rattling off her license plate and name. "Running a check." Naomi stood quietly by the car, her hands now clasped in front of her. She didn't fidget or glance around nervously. Instead, she kept her gaze steady, occasionally shifting her weight from one foot to the other. Carter watched her, annoyed by her composure. She wasn't acting like someone who had just been pulled over. She wasn't acting scared. "Where are you coming from?" he asked abruptly.
"I'm on my way to an appointment," Naomi said, her tone polite.
"What kind of appointment?" Carter pressed, stepping closer again. "It's personal," she replied. Carter sneered, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Personal, huh? Well, I'll make this personal. I don't like liars. You sure there's nothing in that car I should know about?" Naomi tilted her head slightly, her calm expression unbroken. "I've already told you the truth, officer." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, there was only the sound of a bird chirping in the distance. Carter's jaw tightened. He turned sharply and walked back to her car, opening the driver's side door and leaning in. The interior was as spotless as he had seen earlier, with nothing out of place. He scanned the cup holders, the back seat, the floor mats, nothing. His irritation grew as he returned to his patrol car. He pulled out Naomi's license and began typing her information into the system. The screen flickered as the database processed the request. His fingers drummed against the keyboard impatiently. "No priors, no warrants," he muttered to himself, almost disappointed. He glanced up at Naomi through the windshield of his cruiser. She stood calmly by her car, her head slightly tilted toward the sky, as though she were enjoying the warm breeze. Something about her didn't sit right with him, and he wasn't about to let it go. The metallic clink of the handcuffs was louder than it needed to be, punctuating the stillness of the quiet suburban street. Naomi Wright's wrists were now bound behind her back, but her face betrayed no emotion, no anger, no fear, just the same calm composure that had been there from the start. It irritated Carter to no end. "Into the car," Carter barked, his voice sharp as he opened the back door of his cruiser. Naomi complied, stepping into the back seat with quiet dignity. The cuffs dug into her wrists as she adjusted her position, but she made no complaint. Carter slammed the door shut harder than necessary and stalked to the front of the vehicle. Sliding into the driver's seat, he adjusted the rearview mirror to keep her in sight. "What's your deal?" he muttered, more to himself than to her. He glanced at her reflection in the mirror. Her gaze wasn't on him. It was directed out the side window, as though she had no interest in engaging with him at all. That irritated him even more. He grabbed the radio again. "Unit 5. This is Carter. Still waiting on that check." "Run it again." The dispatcher's voice crackled back. "Carter, there's nothing on her. No priors, no warrants, clean license. She's clear." Carter frowned, his grip tightening on the radio. "That's impossible." "Run it again." There was a pause on the other end, and the dispatcher's voice returned, a touch of annoyance creeping in. "She's clean, Carter. Let her go." He slammed the radio back into its cradle, ignoring the dispatcher's advice. Something about this woman felt off, and he wasn't about to let it slide. "Where were you really going?" he asked, turning in his seat to face her. His voice had the sharp edge of someone trying to provoke a reaction. Naomi's gaze shifted from the window to him, her expression calm but firm. "I told you. I have an appointment in the city." "What kind of appointment?" Carter pressed, his tone growing more accusatory. "Doctor's visit? Meeting a friend? Or maybe something you don't want to talk about?" Naomi's eyes met his in the mirror, unflinching. "It's personal, officer." The way she said officer was like a slap, precise, polite, but firm enough to remind him that she wasn't afraid of him. Carter leaned back, shaking his head in mock disbelief. "You know," he said, his voice laced with disdain, "people like you think they can do whatever they want. Drive around like you own the place. Act like the rules don't apply to you." Naomi didn't respond. Her silence was deafening, her composure a sharp contrast to his growing frustration. "What are you hiding?" he demanded, turning fully in his seat now. "Drugs? Stolen property? You think I can't figure it out?" Naomi's lips parted slightly, and for the first time, she spoke with a hint of emotion in her voice. "I have nothing to hide, officer." Her words, though calm, carried a weight that made Carter pause. For a moment, he simply stared at her, his jaw tightening. Then he exhaled sharply and turned back to his dashboard. The quiet was interrupted by a faint buzz. Naomi shifted slightly in the back seat, and Carter realized the sound was coming from her phone, still in her pocket. He turned around sharply. "What's that?" "My phone," Naomi replied. "It's ringing." Carter's eyes narrowed. "Who's calling you?" "I don't know," she said simply. "I'd like to answer it." He smirked, shaking his head. "Oh, you'd like to answer it? Sorry, lady, but you're in no position to make requests." The phone buzzed again, longer this time, signaling a voicemail. Naomi's expression remained unchanged. She leaned back slightly, her eyes shifting back to the window. Carter's jaw tightened. He hated the way she wasn't reacting. Most people begged, pleaded, or at least argued when he pulled stunts like this. But Naomi wasn't playing along, and it was making him feel like he wasn't in control. The phone buzzed again, and this time Carter reached back and pulled it out of her pocket. He held it up, squinting at the screen. The name of the caller wasn't listed, just unknown number. That made him pause. "Who's calling you?" he asked again, holding the phone up so she could see the screen. Naomi's gaze flicked to the phone for a brief moment before returning to the window. "You'll have to answer it to find out," Carter sneered, holding the phone just out of her reach. "Yeah, I don't think so. Whatever this is, it's not going to help you." He set the phone on the passenger seat, its screen darkening as the call ended. For a moment, the quiet returned, but the tension in the air was palpable. Carter could feel it in his chest, in the way his fingers twitched against the steering wheel. Naomi's voice broke the silence. "Officer, may I ask a question?" Carter turned to her, his irritation clear. "What? What exactly are you hoping to accomplish?" she asked, her tone calm, almost curious. Carter leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You think this is a game? You think I don't know when someone's trying to hide something?" Naomi tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "I think you're trying very hard to prove something that isn't there." Her words landed like a slap. Carter stared at her, his face tightening. Before he could respond, the crackle of his radio interrupted. "Unit 5, status check," the dispatcher's voice said. "Everything okay over there?" Carter grabbed the radio, his tone clipped. "Routine stop. I'll let you know if I need backup." As he set the radio down, his eyes drifted back to Naomi. She was still calm, still composed, and somehow still in control of the situation despite the handcuffs and the cruiser's locked doors. Carter couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something, and that unsettled him more than anything else. The stillness inside the patrol car was thick, the kind of silence that bore down on Carter like a weight. Naomi sat in the back seat, her gaze fixed out the window, her posture as calm as ever. Her silence wasn't submission, it was defiance, and Carter could feel it in every nerve of his body. "Who do you think you're fooling?" Carter muttered, mostly to himself, as he tapped his fingers against the steering wheel. Naomi didn't answer. Her lack of reaction was maddening. Outside the car, the quiet suburban street carried on as usual. Cars passed occasionally, their drivers glancing briefly at the flashing lights but continuing on their way. A woman jogging on the opposite sidewalk slowed as she neared the scene, her eyes lingering on the patrol car before quickening her pace. But there was someone else, someone who didn't just pass by. A young man in a hoodie, holding a smartphone, stood a few yards away on the sidewalk. He wasn't in a hurry to leave. Instead, he raised his phone, the device angled toward the patrol car. Carter didn't notice him at first, his attention fixed on Naomi and his growing frustration. "Stay right there," Carter barked as he stepped out of the car, slamming the door shut behind him. Naomi's eyes followed him briefly before turning back to the window. The man with the phone didn't flinch when Carter approached. He kept recording, his expression neutral but focused. "What are you doing?" Carter asked, his voice hard. "Just making sure everything's okay," the man said evenly, lowering his phone slightly but not putting it away. "Everything's fine," Carter snapped. "Move along." The man shrugged. "Public street. I've got a right to be here." Carter took a step closer, his hand brushing the taser on his belt. "I said move along." The man hesitated, his eyes flicking to the patrol car. Through the window,
Naomi sat unmoving, her figure barely visible in the back seat. The man's expression shifted, a flicker of concern crossing his face. He raised his phone again. "Just making sure she's okay," he repeated, his tone firmer this time. Carter's jaw tightened. He wanted to push the issue, to force the man to leave, but the smartphone in his hand made him think twice. The last thing he needed was his face plastered all over the internet. He turned away sharply, muttering under his breath, and headed back to the car. Inside the car, Naomi's phone buzzed again on the passenger seat. Carter grabbed it, glancing at the screen. Another unknown number. This time, he hesitated. He stared at the phone, his mind racing with possibilities. Who was trying to reach her so persistently? "Who keeps calling you?" he demanded, holding up the phone. Naomi didn't answer. She sat still, her calm gaze fixed ahead. "You think this is funny?" Carter growled, his voice rising. He leaned over the seat, waving the phone in her direction. "You think staying quiet is going to get you out of this?" Naomi finally spoke, her voice as steady as ever. "I told you, officer. I have nothing to hide." The phone buzzed again in his hand. Carter gritted his teeth, the temptation to answer it growing. Instead, he tossed the phone back onto the passenger seat and grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 5, he said, his tone clipped. "I need a deeper background check on Naomi Wright. Something's not adding up here." The dispatcher's voice crackled back. "Unit 5, you've already run her info twice. No priors, no warrants, nothing outstanding. What are you looking for?" Carter's grip on the radio tightened. "I need more than what's on the surface. Anything unusual. Financials, associates, employment records." There was a pause on the other end. The dispatcher's tone was cautious when she replied. "Carter, that's not standard protocol. You've got no grounds for—" "Just do it," Carter snapped, cutting her off. He dropped the radio back into its cradle, his frustration mounting. Naomi's calm presence in the back seat felt like an indictment of his authority. She wasn't scared, wasn't intimidated, and it made him feel powerless. Outside, the man with the phone was still recording. Another passerby had stopped, a middle-aged woman with a stroller, her eyes darting between the patrol car and the young man with the phone. "What's going on?" she asked quietly. "Not sure," the man replied, lowering his voice. "But it doesn't look right." The woman nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. She stayed where she was, standing a few feet away, her body half turned toward the scene. The tension was building, though Carter seemed oblivious to it. Inside the car, Naomi broke the silence again. "Officer, may I ask something?" Carter turned sharply, his expression dark. "What?" Naomi tilted her head slightly. "What exactly are you trying to prove?" Her words landed like a challenge. Carter leaned closer, his hands gripping the partition between them. "What I'm trying to prove is that you're not as innocent as you want me to believe. People like you always think you can get away with—" The sound of an approaching car cut him off. Carter's head whipped around, his hand instinctively going to his belt as a black SUV rolled to a stop behind his patrol car. The vehicle's tinted windows gleamed under the sun, revealing nothing of its occupants. Naomi's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, the first shift in her expression since the ordeal began. Carter stepped out of the car, his posture tense as he approached the SUV. The man with the phone shifted slightly, angling his camera to capture the scene. The driver's door of the SUV opened slowly, and a man in a sharp black suit stepped out. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. He adjusted his tie, his gaze landing on Carter with a calm intensity that immediately unsettled the officer. "Can I help you?" Carter asked, his voice hard but faltering slightly. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced briefly at Naomi through the patrol car window. Then he turned back to Carter, a faint smile on his lips. "I believe you already have," the man said, his tone smooth but laced with an undertone that Carter couldn't quite place. The air seemed to shift, the tension mounting as Carter stood frozen, unsure of what was about to happen.
The black SUV sat idling behind the patrol car, its polished surface reflecting the late afternoon sunlight. The man in the sharp suit stood motionless for a moment, his calm demeanor starkly contrasting Carter's mounting irritation. Naomi, still in the back seat of the patrol car, turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable as she observed the interaction through the tinted glass. "Who are you, and what are you doing here?" Carter demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. He squared his shoulders, trying to reassert control over the situation. The suited man tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "I'm here for her," he said, gesturing toward Naomi with a subtle nod. His tone was polite, almost casual, but it carried an air of authority that made Carter hesitate. "What do you mean you're here for her?" Carter shot back, his hand instinctively moving toward the taser on his belt. The man took a measured step closer, his movements deliberate. He reached into his jacket pocket, and Carter's hand twitched toward his weapon. But the man merely pulled out a slim leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing a gleaming badge and an ID card. The emblem was unmistakable. Federal. "I'm Agent Reynolds, Department of Justice," the man said, his voice steady. "I believe you've made a mistake." Carter blinked, his confidence faltering for the first time. He glanced at the badge, then at the agent's face, searching for any sign of deception. "A mistake? What kind of mistake?" Reynolds didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his attention to Naomi, his expression softening slightly. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked, ignoring Carter entirely. Naomi nodded, her calm composure intact. "I'm fine, thank you." The exchange made Carter's blood boil. He stepped closer to Reynolds, his voice rising. "You don't get to waltz in here and take over. She's under arrest. This is my scene." Reynolds turned back to Carter, his expression still calm but with a faint edge of steel. "Your scene, officer." He glanced briefly at Carter's name tag. "Carter, is it? Let me be clear. You're in over your head." "In over my head?" Carter repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "She broke the law. I pulled her over for..." "For what?" Reynolds interrupted, his tone sharper now. "A traffic violation? Or something else?" Carter froze, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to form a response. Reynolds didn't wait for an answer. He stepped past Carter, heading toward the patrol car. Carter moved to block him, but Reynolds stopped and turned, his eyes locking onto the officers with a cold intensity. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Reynolds said quietly, the weight of his words landing heavily in the tense air. For a moment, the two men stood face to face, the silence crackling with unspoken challenges. Carter finally stepped aside, his jaw tightening as Reynolds continued toward the car. Inside the patrol car, Naomi watched as Reynolds approached. He opened the back door with a smooth motion and extended a hand to help her out. Naomi stepped out gracefully, her posture as composed as ever. The two exchanged a brief look, one that seemed to convey more than words could. "Thank you for your patience," Reynolds said to her, his tone warm. Naomi gave him a small nod, her lips curving into the faintest smile. Reynolds turned back to Carter, who was now standing near the front of the car, his fists clenched at his sides. "Officer Carter, this situation is no longer under your jurisdiction. You're free to return to your duties." "Like hell I will," Carter snapped, his voice breaking slightly. "I'm not going anywhere until I know what's going on." Reynolds sighed, his patience clearly wearing thin. He pulled a slim device from his pocket and tapped the screen. "If you insist on making this difficult, I'll have no choice but to escalate this to your precinct captain." Carter's face flushed. He could feel the situation slipping further out of his control, and the presence of the man with the phone, still recording nearby, only made it worse. He glanced toward the onlookers, his stomach twisting at the thought of this incident going public. "Fine," Carter muttered, stepping back but keeping his glare fixed on Reynolds. "But this isn't over." "You're right," Reynolds said, his voice carrying an edge now. "It isn't." The man with the phone lowered his device slightly, exchanging a glance with the woman standing nearby. "Did you hear that? DOJ. What's this about?" "No idea," she replied, her tone hushed but curious. "But it looks like he's in trouble." The young man nodded, raising his phone again to continue recording. He wasn't about to miss what happened next. As the tension between Carter and Reynolds lingered, the sound of another approaching vehicle cut through the air. A second black SUV pulled up beside the first, its doors opening to reveal two more individuals in suits. They moved with purpose, one of them heading toward Reynolds while the other stayed near the car. "All set?" the newcomer asked Reynolds quietly. "Almost," Reynolds replied before turning back to Carter. "I'd suggest you head back to your vehicle now, officer." Carter didn't move. His mind was racing, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He glanced toward Naomi, who stood calmly beside Reynolds, her hands free now and resting lightly at her sides. She wasn't smiling, but there was something in her posture, an unspoken confidence, that unnerved him. "Who the hell is she?" Carter finally asked, his voice low but trembling slightly. Reynolds didn't answer immediately. He exchanged a glance with Naomi before turning back to Carter, his expression unreadable. "That's none of your concern," Reynolds said simply. The words hit Carter harder than he expected. He took a step back, his chest tightening as the reality of his situation began to sink in. For the first time, he felt truly out of his depth. Naomi and Reynolds moved toward the second SUV, the doors opening to let them inside. The agents moved with quiet efficiency, their presence both commanding and unsettling. The onlookers watched in silence, their curiosity mingled with unease. Carter stood frozen by his patrol car, his hands clenching and unclenching as he watched the SUVs pull away. The sound of their engines faded into the distance, leaving him alone on the quiet street. His radio crackled, pulling him from his thoughts. "Unit 5. Status check. Everything okay out there?" Carter didn't respond immediately. He stared at the empty street ahead, his mind racing with unanswered questions. Finally, he grabbed the radio, his voice low and uncertain. "Unit 5. Situations resolved." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't true. Not by a long shot. The street was eerily quiet after the SUVs disappeared, leaving Carter standing by his patrol car, his thoughts a storm of confusion and frustration. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the suburban houses. Despite the apparent calm, tension hung heavy in the air. Carter slid into the driver's seat of his cruiser, slamming the door shut. His hand gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles whitening. He had just been completely overshadowed, his authority dismissed, his actions scrutinized, and by federal agents, no less. His ego burned with humiliation. "Who the hell was she?" he muttered under his breath, his voice trembling with anger. He stared at Naomi's phone, still sitting on the passenger seat, the screen dark now. It buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. Another, unknown number. This time, curiosity got the better of him. He snatched the phone, his thumb hovering over the green answer button. He hesitated. Something about the persistent calls gnawed at him. Finally, he pressed the button and held the phone to his ear. "Hello," he said, his voice hard and impatient. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a calm, authoritative voice. "Who am I speaking to?" Carter stiffened, his grip tightening on the phone. "Officer Daniel Carter." "Who the hell is this?" Another pause. Then the voice replied, cool and deliberate. "Officer Carter, you've just made a very poor decision." Carter's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean by that?" he demanded, his tone defensive. "You've unlawfully detained someone under federal protection," the voice continued, ignoring his question. "And now you're interfering further by answering a phone that doesn't belong to you. This situation is spiraling quickly, officer. I suggest you tread carefully." Carter's chest tightened. "Federal protection?" he spat. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I don't answer to you." "No, you answer to your precinct," the voice replied smoothly. "And as of 10 minutes ago, they've been made aware of your actions. Expect a call soon." Carter opened his mouth to respond, but the line went dead. He stared at the phone, his pulse pounding in his ears. What did they mean, made aware? And how could they have contacted the precinct so quickly? The radio on his dashboard crackled to life, pulling his attention. Unit 5, come in. This is dispatch. Carter hesitated before grabbing the receiver. Go ahead, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Officer Carter, return to the precinct immediately, the dispatcher said, her tone uncharacteristically firm. Captain Barrett wants you back now. Carter swallowed hard. What's this about? Just get back here, she replied curtly. The radio clicked off, leaving no room for argument. The drive back to the precinct felt longer than usual, the silence in the car pressing down on him. Carter's thoughts raced. Who was Naomi Wright? Why had federal agents shown up so quickly? And what had they told his captain? When he pulled into the precinct parking lot, the unease in his chest grew heavier. Several patrol cars were parked haphazardly, and a few officers stood in groups, murmuring to each other. Their conversations stopped when Carter stepped out of his car. Their eyes followed him as he walked toward the entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Officers and staff moved quickly, their expressions tight. Carter headed straight for the captain's office, his boots echoing loudly against the tiled floor. He ignored the stares and whispers that followed him. He reached the office and knocked once before pushing the door open. Captain Barrett was sitting behind his desk, his face pale but set in a hard line. A laptop sat open in front of him, the screen glowing faintly. Close the door, Barrett said, not looking up. Carter did as he was told, his pulse quickening. Captain, what's this about? Barrett leaned back in his chair, finally meeting Carter's eyes. What the hell were you thinking out there? Carter stiffened. Sir, I was conducting a routine traffic stop. Routine? Barrett interrupted, his voice rising. Do you have any idea who you just detained? Carter hesitated, his mind racing. Some woman. Naomi Wright. I was just doing my job. Barrett shook his head, exhaling sharply. Naomi Wright isn't just some woman. She's under federal protection. And now, thanks to you, this department is about to be dragged through the mud. Federal protection? Carter repeated, his voice rising. What does that even mean? Who is she? Barrett's expression darkened. That's above your pay grade, Carter. What you need to understand is that you've made a mistake. One that's already gone public. He turned the laptop toward Carter, who leaned in to see the screen. His stomach dropped. A video of the traffic stop was already circulating online, the title blaring in bold text, Police Harassment of Black Woman Sparks Federal Response. How? Carter stammered, his voice trailing off. The moment someone pulled out a phone, you were done, Barrett said coldly. And now the DOJ is breathing down my neck. They want answers, and they want you suspended pending an investigation. Suspended? Carter shouted, his face flushing with anger. For what? I didn't do anything wrong. Barrett stood, his palms flat on the desk. You detained someone without cause, ignored protocol, and escalated a situation you had no business escalating. And now we're all paying for it. Carter's hands balled into fists. This is insane. She didn't even. Enough. Barrett barked. He pointed toward the door. Turn in your badge and your gun. Now. Carter froze, his chest heaving. He wanted to argue, to fight back, but the look in Barrett's eyes stopped him. Slowly, he reached for his belt, unfastening his badge and holster. He placed them on the desk with trembling hands. Barrett didn't say another word. He just stared at Carter, his expression unreadable. Carter turned and walked out of the office, the stares of his fellow officers burning into him as he made his way through the precinct. The humiliation was overwhelming, but beneath it was something darker, a gnawing fear that this was only the beginning. Carter stormed out of the precinct, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles ached. The echoes of Captain Barrett's words still rang in his ears. Turn in your badge and your gun. The humiliation of being stripped of his authority in front of the entire department burned like fire in his chest. The cool evening air hit his face as he stepped into the parking lot, but it did little to calm him. A group of officers standing by their patrol cars fell silent as he passed. Their stares bore into him, their whispered conversations like knives slicing through his pride. "You'll see," he muttered under his breath as he climbed into his car and slammed the door. He gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Miles away, in a quiet hotel room, Naomi sat at a small desk, her phone resting on the polished wood surface. The room was simple but elegant, the kind of place where nothing was out of place. A cup of tea steamed beside her as she scrolled through her phone, watching the video that had now gone viral. The footage, shot by the man on the sidewalk, captured every moment of the interaction with Carter. His aggression, her calmness, the arrival of the black SUV, it was all there, and the public reaction was swift. Comments flooded in by the second. "This is disgusting. When will this stop? She handled herself with so much grace. What a hero. Who does this cop think he is? He should be fired." Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't surprised by the response, but the weight of it still sat heavily on her shoulders. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention away from the video. It was a text message from Agent Reynolds. "We're monitoring the fallout. Stay ready." She set the phone down, her eyes lingering on the screen. There was no satisfaction in watching the public outrage grow. This was never about revenge. It was about the truth. Back in the precinct, Captain Barrett sat in his office, his head in his hands. The laptop screen in front of him replayed the video on loop, each view a reminder of how badly things had spiraled out of control. His phone buzzed incessantly, calls from reporters, demands from his superiors, questions from the community. Finally, he picked up, his voice strained. "Barrett." The voice on the other end was cold, clipped. "Captain, this is Deputy Director Hayes at the DOJ. I trust you've seen the video." "I've seen it," Barrett replied, his tone defensive. "We're handling it internally." "Internally isn't good enough," Hayes shot back. "Your officer violated protocol, detained a federal asset without cause, and escalated a situation that could have been avoided entirely. Do you understand the position you've put us in?" Barrett swallowed hard. "We're cooperating fully with the investigation. Carter has been suspended, and—" "Suspension isn't enough," Hayes interrupted. "The public wants accountability, and they're going to get it. We've already issued a formal statement condemning the actions of your officer. If this department wants to salvage any credibility, I suggest you get ahead of this before it spirals further." The line went dead, leaving Barrett staring at his phone. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He knew the weight of what was coming, and there was little he could do to stop it. At his apartment, Carter paced the small living room, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. He had been glued to social media all evening, watching as the video of the stop gained traction. News outlets had picked it up, running headlines like, "Traffic stop sparks DOJ investigation into police misconduct. Officer suspended after viral video exposes questionable arrest." Every article, every comment, felt like a personal attack. His phone buzzed again, another call from an unknown number. He ignored it, throwing the phone onto the couch. His anger bubbled over, and he punched the wall, the drywall cracking under the force. "They don't know anything," he shouted, his voice echoing in the empty apartment. "I was doing my job." But even as he said the words, a nagging doubt crept into his mind. Was he really? Or had he let something else drive his actions? Meanwhile, Naomi stepped into a quiet conference room in the hotel. Agent Reynolds was waiting for her, his suit immaculate, his expression calm but serious. "It's escalating," he said, gesturing to a monitor on the wall displaying a live news broadcast. The video of her arrest played on a loop, interspersed with clips of protests beginning to form outside the precinct. "It was bound to," Naomi replied, sitting across from him. "People are tired of this happening." Reynolds nodded. "The department's scrambling. Carter's been suspended, and Barrett is taking heat from every angle. But this isn't over yet." Naomi's gaze hardened. "It won't be over until real change happens. This isn't just about one bad cop. It's about a system that lets people like him act without consequences." Reynolds leaned forward, his tone lowering. "You've done your part, Naomi.
The DOJ is stepping in. Let us handle it from here. Naomi shook her head. No. I won't disappear while this plays out. People need to see what accountability looks like. Reynolds hesitated but finally nodded. All right. Just know that this isn't going to be easy. Naomi's voice was firm. It never is. As the night deepened, Carter sat in the darkened living room, a bottle of beer untouched on the table in front of him. His phone buzzed again, and this time, he picked it up. The caller ID read, Captain Barrett. Carter hesitated before answering. Captain, he said, his voice low. Carter, Barrett replied, his tone heavy. We need to talk. Carter's stomach twisted. He knew whatever was coming next wasn't going to be good. Carter leaned back on his couch, the phone pressed to his ear. Captain Barrett's voice on the other end of the line was sharp, tinged with exhaustion and anger. I don't have time to sugarcoat this, Carter, Barrett began. You've put this entire department under a spotlight we can't escape from. Carter sat up, his jaw tightening. With all due respect, Captain, I was just doing my job. Barrett let out a harsh laugh, void of humor. Your job was to follow protocol, de-escalate, and handle situations professionally. Instead, you've given the DOJ a reason to tear us apart. She was acting suspicious, Carter argued, his voice rising. She was too calm, like she had something to hide. Barrett cut him off. And what exactly did you find, Carter? Drugs. Weapons. Anything at all. The silence that followed was deafening. Carter's grip on the phone tightened, his pulse quickening. Finally, he muttered, No, but, Barrett snapped. You let your damn ego take over. And now the public's eating us alive, the DOJ's breathing down my neck, and the precinct is falling apart. This is bigger than you, Carter. Carter stood, pacing the room as his frustration bubbled over. You're just going to hang me out to dry, aren't you? Throw me to the wolves to save your own skin. You think this is about me? Barrett shot back. You're the one who decided to ignore every ounce of training you've ever had. Now you've got to live with the consequences. Carter clenched his jaw, his knuckles white around the phone. So that's it? You're done with me. Barrett's tone softened slightly, but the edge remained. Look, Carter, the DOJ is coming for answers, and they're not going to stop until they get them. If I were you, I'd stop talking and start listening to a lawyer. Before Carter could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone, the realization of just how alone he was sinking in. The next morning, the precinct was a storm of activity. News vans lined the streets outside, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. Protesters gathered nearby, holding signs that read, Justice for Naomi, and chanting slogans demanding accountability. Officers moved in and out of the building quickly, avoiding the cameras. Inside, Captain Barrett sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen. His inbox was flooded with emails from city officials, reporters, and the DOJ. Every message demanded the same thing: answers. A sharp knock on his door broke his focus. Come in, he barked. The door opened, and Agent Reynolds stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He closed the door behind him and sat across from Barrett without waiting for an invitation. Captain Barrett, Reynolds began, his tone measured. We need to talk about Carter. Barrett exhaled heavily, leaning back in his chair. What more is there to say? He's suspended, pending investigation. Reynolds nodded. That's a start, but the investigation isn't just about Carter anymore. It's about your entire department. Barrett's eyes narrowed. My department? This was one officer's mistake. A mistake that reflects a pattern, Reynolds countered. A pattern of misconduct, unchecked authority, and systemic issues. Carter's just the tip of the iceberg. Barrett's face darkened. You're not pinning this on me. Reynolds leaned forward, his gaze piercing. I don't need to. The evidence speaks for itself. But if you want to salvage what's left of your reputation, you'd better cooperate fully. Barrett didn't respond, his jaw tightening as Reynolds stood and adjusted his suit. We'll be in touch,
Reynolds said before leaving the office. Elsewhere in the city, Naomi sat at a small cafe, a cup of coffee steaming in front of her. The air buzzed with the sound of conversations, but her focus was on the tablet in her hands. News articles and social media posts filled the screen, detailing the fallout from her arrest. Naomi! She looked up to see Reynolds standing nearby, his expression softer than it had been the night before. He slid into the seat across from her, setting his phone on the table. "How are you holding up?" he asked. Naomi shrugged. "I'm used to this kind of attention. But it's not about me. It's about what happens next." Reynolds nodded. "The pressure is mounting. The protests are growing, and the DOJ's investigation is gaining momentum. Barrett's feeling the heat, but Carter..." He hesitated. "Carter's spiraling." Naomi's brow furrowed. "Spiraling how?" "He's angry, desperate," Reynolds explained. "He's not handling the suspension well. We're keeping an eye on him, but I thought you should know." Naomi sipped her coffee, her gaze thoughtful. "Do you think he'll come after me?" Reynolds shook his head. "Not directly. But people like him don't go down quietly. He might try to twist the narrative or dig up something he can use against you." Naomi's lips curved into a faint smile. "Let him try. The truth is on my side." Reynolds smiled back, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Just be careful, Naomi. This isn't over yet." That evening, Carter sat alone in a dimly lit bar, nursing a glass of whiskey. The low hum of conversation around him felt distant, like static in the background of his thoughts. His phone buzzed on the table, and he glanced at the screen, another news alert about the protests outside the precinct. He swiped it away angrily, his mind racing. They were making him the scapegoat, painting him as the villain. But he wasn't going to let them destroy him without a fight. As he downed the rest of his drink, a thought took shape in his mind. A plan. He wasn't going to wait for the investigation to ruin him. He'd find a way to shift the blame, to regain control. And if it meant dragging others down with him, so be it. The bar felt heavier as the night wore on, the dim lighting casting long shadows across Carter's face. The anger simmering in his chest had turned into something sharper. Determination. If the department, the media, and the DOJ wanted a fight, he was going to give them one. Carter's mind raced as he flipped through his phone, searching for anything he could use. His suspension meant he no longer had access to department systems, but years on the force had given him connections and leverage. He scrolled to a name he hadn't called in years. Sergeant Blake Harwell. Blake was an old friend, a veteran officer who'd been quietly shuffled into an administrative role after several complaints of misconduct. Carter knew he'd kept tabs on the department's inner workings, and more importantly, he owed Carter a favor. Carter dialed the number. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Carter, what the hell do you want?" "Blake," Carter began, his tone low and urgent. "I need your help. It's about this DOJ mess. They're trying to take me down, and I need something to fight back." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a dry laugh. "What? You want me to risk my neck because you screwed up?" "Not happening." "I didn't screw up," Carter snapped. "They're making me the scapegoat, Blake. They're coming after me, but they'll come after everyone else next. You know how this works. They'll dig into every corner of the department, and when they find dirt, they'll pin it on anyone they can." Blake was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his tone was quieter. "What are you looking for?" "Anything on Barrett," Carter said quickly. "You and I both know he's not clean. If I can shift the heat onto him, I might have a chance to get out of this." Blake exhaled sharply. "You're playing with fire, Carter. If this backfires..." "It won't," Carter cut him off. "You're sitting on records, aren't you? I know you've got access to the internal logs. Just find me something. Anything. I can use." After a long pause, Blake muttered, "Give me a couple of hours." The line went dead. Meanwhile, Naomi sat in her hotel room, her tablet propped up on the desk as she watched a live news broadcast. Footage of the protests outside the precinct filled the screen. The crowd had grown larger, their chants echoing through the streets. Signs bearing phrases like "accountability now" and "justice for all" waved in the air. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was a text from Agent Reynolds. "Turn on the news. Carter might be trying something." Naomi frowned and switched the channel. The screen showed a panel discussion with legal experts debating the case. One of them, a sharp-eyed woman in a navy suit, leaned forward, her tone serious. "What's happening here isn't just about one officer," she said. "It's about a system that protects people like him. But Carter's behavior has already set a dangerous precedent. If he's working to deflect blame, it could derail the entire investigation." Naomi sighed, her grip tightening on the tablet. She had expected resistance, but the idea of Carter actively working to undermine the case unsettled her. She picked up her phone and dialed Reynolds. "Reynolds," he answered after one ring. "Carter's not going to go down quietly," Naomi said without preamble. "What are we doing to stop him?" "We've got eyes on him," Reynolds replied. "If he makes a move, we'll know. But he's desperate, and desperate people are unpredictable." Naomi leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "We can't wait for him to act. We need to stay ahead of him." "We're working on it," Reynolds assured her. "In the meantime, keep your head down. He's likely feeling cornered, and that makes you a target too." Naomi nodded, though the idea of being a target didn't faze her. She'd been in the spotlight before. What mattered now was ensuring the truth prevailed. In a dimly lit office at the precinct, Blake Harwell sifted through the department's records, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The glow of the monitor illuminated his tired face as he searched for anything tied to Captain Barrett. Years of internal memos, case reports, and complaints scrolled by on the screen. Finally, he stopped. His eyes narrowed as he opened a file labeled "Disciplinary Actions. Confidential." Inside were records of several incidents involving Barrett, instances of suppressed evidence, questionable case closures, and allegations that had mysteriously disappeared. Blake leaned back, exhaling slowly. He knew what he was looking at. This wasn't just dirt, it was dynamite. But sharing it with Carter was a risk. If the DOJ got wind of this, it could blow back on everyone, himself included. After a moment of hesitation, he downloaded the files onto a flash drive. He picked up his phone and dialed Carter. "I've got something," he said when Carter answered. "But you didn't get this from me." "I owe you one," Carter replied, his voice triumphant. "You owe me more than that," Blake muttered before hanging up. Carter sat back in his car, staring at the flash drive in his hand. His lips curled into a smirk. Barrett wasn't untouchable, and now he had proof. The tide was about to turn, and this time, Carter would make sure he wasn't the one drowning. The drive to his apartment felt shorter than usual as Carter gripped the flash drive tightly in his hand. The city lights blurred past his windows, his mind racing with thoughts of how to use the leverage he now possessed. Barrett wanted to hang him out to dry? Fine. He'd make sure the captain burned with him. When Carter reached his apartment, he locked the door behind him and sat at his cluttered desk. He plugged the flash drive into his laptop, the screen lighting up with a folder labeled Barrett, Confidential. His heart raced as he clicked through the files. Case reports, emails, internal complaints, and memos detailing Barrett's involvement in suppressing evidence and manipulating investigations. One file caught his eye. Elijah Grant incident. Suppression order. Carter froze, his stomach tightening as he opened the document. It detailed how Barrett had personally ensured that body cam footage and witness statements in the controversial case of Elijah Grant, a young black man shot by officers, were buried. The name resonated with Carter. It was a case that had sparked protests years ago but had seemingly disappeared from public discourse. "I knew it," Carter muttered to himself, leaning back in his chair. His mind reeled at the implications. This wasn't just about Barrett, it was about a system that had enabled him. But Carter wasn't thinking about justice. He was thinking about survival. If he could make Barrett the face of the scandal, he might just save himself. He pulled out his phone and began drafting an anonymous email. He attached the files, carefully crafting a message to the local press and typing, "This is what your precinct captain doesn't want you to see." He hesitated for a moment, his finger hovering over the send button. Then he pressed it. The files were sent, and there was no turning back. The next morning, the city woke to a firestorm. News outlets were ablaze with headlines. Whistleblower leaks evidence of police corruption in high-profile case. Captain Barrett implicated in Elijah Grant cover-up. Justice delayed. How far does the corruption go? The leaked files included internal emails where Barrett instructed officers to lose evidence and pressured witnesses to change their statements. Public outrage grew as the Elijah Grant case resurfaced, with activists demanding justice for the young man whose death had been swept under the rug. At the precinct, chaos reigned. Reporters swarmed the building, cameras flashing as officers tried to push through the crowd. Inside, Captain Barrett sat in his office, staring blankly at the screen of his laptop. His phone rang incessantly, calls from city officials and union representatives demanding answers. Barrett slammed his fist on the desk, his face flushed with anger. "Who the hell leaked this?" he growled, pacing the room. He knew the files had come from within, but the scope of the leak was devastating. His career, his reputation, everything he had built, was now on the line. A sharp knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He barked, "Come in." Agent Reynolds stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He closed the door behind him and sat across from Barrett without waiting for an invitation. "Captain," Reynolds began calmly, "we need to talk." "Talk about what?" Barrett snapped. "You already got what you wanted. My career is over, thanks to you and your damn investigation." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Don't blame me for the choices you made, Barrett. This goes beyond you. The DOJ is here to clean house." Barrett glared at him. "You think you're better than me? You think your agents don't bend the rules when it suits them?" "This isn't about me," Reynolds replied, his tone icy. "It's about accountability. And right now you've got none." Elsewhere, Naomi sat in the corner of a bustling cafe, scrolling through her phone. The leaked files dominated the news, the details more damning than she had anticipated. Her face was calm, but her mind churned with thoughts of the fight ahead. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was a text from Agent Reynolds. "The files are out. The protests are growing. Be ready to make a statement." Naomi set the phone down, staring out the window. She knew this moment would come, but the magnitude of it still felt overwhelming. She wasn't just a victim in this story. She was a catalyst for change, and people were looking to her for leadership. In a dingy bar, Carter sat hunched over a drink, his eyes fixed on the TV mounted in the corner. News anchors dissected the leaked files, their voices blending into a chaotic hum. He smirked as he watched Barrett's face flash on the screen, the captain now the center of a national scandal. "You thought you could throw me under the bus," Carter muttered to himself, raising his glass. "How's that working out for you?" But his moment of triumph was short-lived. His phone buzzed with a notification, and his smirk faded as he read the message. "This isn't over. We know it was you." Carter's chest tightened. He looked around the bar, paranoia creeping in. The shadows seemed darker, the patrons' voices quieter, as though everyone was watching him. "Let them come," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Deep down, he knew he had only delayed the inevitable. That evening, as the protests swelled outside the precinct, Naomi stood on the steps of City Hall, a microphone in hand. The crowd quieted as she raised her head, her calm gaze sweeping over the sea of faces. "This isn't just about me," she began, her voice steady. "It's about all of us. It's about a system that has failed too many for too long. We're here today because we refuse to let injustice go unchecked. We demand accountability, not just for what happened to me, but for every life that's been affected by abuse of power." The crowd erupted into applause, their chants of "justice now" echoing through the night. Naomi stepped back, her expression resolute. The fight wasn't over, but tonight, the tides had shifted. The city was alive with unrest. Protests had grown to thousands, spreading from the precinct to City Hall and even further into neighboring districts. Signs demanding justice waved in the air, and chants reverberated through the streets. No justice, no peace. Accountability now. Naomi stood at the edge of one of the largest demonstrations yet, flanked by Agent Reynolds and a small team of DOJ representatives. Her presence was both symbolic and deliberate. She hadn't sought the spotlight, but she knew that in this moment, her voice carried weight. Reynolds leaned in, speaking low enough that only she could hear. "You sure about this? Once you speak, there's no taking it back." Naomi nodded, her expression calm but resolute. "It's never been about me, Reynolds. It's about what happens next." The agent stepped back as Naomi climbed the makeshift platform. The crowd noticed her immediately, their cheers and chants reaching a fever pitch. She raised her hand, and slowly, the noise began to settle. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady despite the overwhelming energy in the air. "Thank you for standing here today. Thank you for demanding what's right, not just for me, but for all of us." The crowd roared in approval, and Naomi paused to let the moment settle before continuing. "This isn't the first time someone like me has been treated unfairly. This isn't the first time someone in power abused their authority. But it needs to be the last." Her words hit like a hammer, the crowd responding with chants of, "Enough is enough." "We've seen the files," Naomi continued, her voice rising. "We know the truth about Captain Barrett, about Officer Carter, and about the system that allowed them to operate without accountability. The time for excuses is over. The time for change is now." The crowd's cheers were deafening. Naomi stepped back, her heart pounding as she handed the microphone to one of the protest organizers. She had said her piece, and now the momentum belonged to the people. Inside the precinct, Barrett sat alone in his office. The noise from the protesters outside filtered through the thick glass, a constant reminder of how quickly things had spiraled out of control. His phone buzzed on the desk, but he ignored it. The calls had become relentless, reporters, city officials, and even his own family demanding answers. He poured himself a drink from the small cabinet in the corner of the room, his hand trembling slightly. The leaked files had exposed everything: his involvement in the Elijah Grant case, his history of suppressing evidence, and his complicity in covering up misconduct within his department. The media had already branded him a villain, and his superiors were scrambling to distance themselves from him. "Damn Carter," he muttered, slamming the glass down on the desk. He knew the files hadn't leaked themselves. Carter had always been reckless, but this time, he had gone too far. Barrett's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He didn't bother answering, and a moment later, Agent Reynolds stepped in uninvited. "Captain," Reynolds said, his tone clipped. "We need to talk." Barrett didn't look up. "Haven't you done enough damage?" "This isn't about me," Reynolds replied, his voice cold. "This is about accountability. You've been given every chance to cooperate, and instead, you've doubled down. Now it's out of your hands." Barrett finally looked up, his face twisted in anger. "You think this is justice? Destroying a man's career because of one mistake?" Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "One mistake? Barrett, this isn't about one mistake. It's about a pattern of corruption that's gone unchecked for years. You've been caught, and now you're going to face the consequences." Barrett opened his mouth to argue, but Reynolds held up a hand, cutting him off. "Save it. The DOJ is filing formal charges against you. I suggest you get a lawyer." Reynolds turned and left, leaving Barrett alone with the weight of his downfall. At his apartment, Carter sat in the dark, staring at his laptop screen. He had watched Barrett's press conference earlier in the day, where the captain had attempted to shift the blame for the department's failures. It hadn't gone well. Reporters had bombarded Barrett with questions about the leaked files, his past misconduct, and the protests outside the precinct. Carter felt a twisted sense of satisfaction watching Barrett squirm. But that satisfaction was short-lived. His phone buzzed on the table, and he hesitated before picking it up. "Carter," came a voice on the other end, low and deliberate. He didn't recognize it. "Who is this?" Carter asked, his pulse quickening. "Doesn't matter," the voice replied. "What matters is that we know what you did. You leaked those files, didn't you?" Carter's grip on the phone tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." The voice chuckled darkly. "Sure you don't. But here's the thing. You didn't just take down Barrett. You brought a lot of attention to yourself. And some of us don't appreciate that kind of attention." The line went dead, leaving Carter staring at his phone, his chest tight with fear. He suddenly felt very alone. As the evening wore on, Naomi returned to her hotel room, exhausted but resolute. She sat by the window, watching the city lights twinkle against the night sky. Her phone buzzed with a message from Reynolds. "Good work today. The movement is gaining strength." She replied simply, "This is just the beginning." Naomi leaned back, her gaze turning to the city below. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt the weight of momentum shifting. The truth was out, and now, it was only a matter of time before justice followed. The protests outside the precinct showed no signs of slowing. By now, the demonstration had grown into a massive gathering, with people from all walks of life joining to demand accountability. News cameras captured every chant, every raised fist, and every moment of tension as the police line stood watch, their presence doing little to quell the growing energy of the crowd. Inside, Captain Barrett's office was a flurry of chaos. His desk was buried under stacks of paperwork and his laptop blared with notifications, emails from city officials, demands for explanations, and urgent messages from legal counsel. Barrett sat slumped in his chair, his face pale, his shirt collar undone. His power was slipping through his fingers, and he knew it. A sharp knock on the door jolted him from his thoughts. Before he could respond, Agent Reynolds entered, his expression severe. "Barrett, it's time," Reynolds said, his voice flat. Barrett's gaze darted to the clock on the wall. He knew what Reynolds meant. The DOJ had formally charged him with obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and abuse of power. He had spent the last few hours hoping for a miracle, a way out. But now, it was clear none was coming. "You think this makes you a hero?" Barrett sneered, rising to his feet. "You're just another suit playing politics." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "This isn't about politics, Barrett. It's about justice. Something you forgot a long time ago." Barrett grabbed his coat, his movements stiff with anger. He stepped past Reynolds, his shoulders squared, but the weight of his defeat was evident in every step. Outside, officers and staff watched in silence as Barrett walked through the precinct for the last time, escorted by federal agents. The moment he stepped outside, the protesters erupted. Cries of shame and justice for Elijah filled the air as Barrett was led to a waiting car. Cameras flashed, capturing every second of his humiliation. For the first time in his career, Barrett was on the other side of the system he had spent decades protecting. At his apartment, Carter sat on the couch, a glass of whiskey untouched in front of him. The news was on, showing live footage of Barrett's arrest. Carter's phone buzzed on the table, but he ignored it. He had no interest in speaking to anyone. Not now, not while his own future hung in the balance. He watched as the news anchor detailed the charges against Barrett. The words felt heavy in the air: obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, corruption. Carter should have felt relief, satisfaction even, but instead, a gnawing dread crept over him. He knew Barrett wasn't the only one the DOJ was looking at. His own actions during the traffic stop, his history of complaints, and now the leaked files, they had painted a target on his back. And Carter had no illusions about how far they would go to make an example of him. The phone buzzed again. This time, Carter grabbed it, his voice rough as he answered. "What?" The voice on the other end was cold and clipped. "This is your final warning, Carter. Keep your head down or you'll regret it." Carter's hand tightened around the phone. "Who the hell is this?" But the line went dead, leaving Carter staring at the screen, his chest tightening with fear. He threw the phone onto the couch, his thoughts spiraling. The cracks in his world were widening, and he had no idea how to stop the collapse. Meanwhile, Naomi sat in a quiet hotel room, scrolling through her phone. The video of Barrett's arrest was everywhere, and the public response was overwhelming. Social media was flooded with comments. Hashtags like #JusticeForElijah and #accountability now trending worldwide. Her phone buzzed with a call. It was Agent Reynolds. "Naomi," he said, his tone lighter than usual. "Barrett's out. The DOJ is moving full steam ahead."
This is a big win. Naomi exhaled, a small smile tugging at her lips. It's a step, she said. But there's still work to do. Carter isn't off the hook, and this department has more to answer for than just Barrett. I know, Reynolds replied. But you've done more than most would. You've shifted the conversation, and that's no small feat. Naomi leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the window. It's not about me, Reynolds. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again. At the precinct, the mood was tense. Officers whispered in small groups, their faces a mixture of relief and apprehension. With Barrett gone, the chain of command was in disarray, and the DOJ's presence loomed over every corner of the building. One officer muttered to another, "You think Carter's next?" The other shrugged. "Probably. You don't leak files like that and walk away clean." Their conversation trailed off as a group of federal agents walked through the precinct, their presence a stark reminder that the investigation was far from over. The city buzzed with anticipation. Barrett's arrest had sent shockwaves through the community, the precinct, and even the highest levels of government. News channels ran 24/7 coverage of the scandal, dissecting every detail of the leaked files and the ensuing fallout. But amidst the chaos, there was an unsettling quiet, a silence that spoke of something brewing beneath the surface. Naomi stood at the window of her hotel room, the city lights reflecting in her calm eyes. The protests had grown into a full-fledged movement, sparking similar demonstrations in neighboring cities. People were no longer just calling for Barrett's accountability, they wanted systemic reform. Her phone buzzed on the desk. It was Agent Reynolds. "Naomi, we need you to meet us at City Hall." "Something big is about to happen," he said, his tone urgent but measured. "What now?" Naomi asked, though she was already gathering her things. "Carter's making a move," Reynolds replied. "And it's not good." Naomi paused, her grip tightening on her bag. "What kind of move?" "Just get here," Reynolds said before the line went dead. In the dim confines of his apartment, Carter stared at his laptop, a twisted smirk playing on his lips. The flash drive still sat on the table, but it was useless now. He had already set things in motion. On the screen was an open email draft, filled with a carefully constructed narrative. He wasn't going down alone. If the department wanted to sacrifice him, he'd make sure they bled for it. "Let's see how they like this," Carter muttered, hitting send. The email, addressed to multiple media outlets, promised an exclusive exposé on corruption not just within the precinct but within the DOJ itself. The files he attached were doctored, distorted to implicate Naomi and even Agent Reynolds in fabricated misconduct. He leaned back in his chair, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. He didn't care if it was true. He just needed to muddy the waters enough to buy himself time. But Carter's triumph was short-lived. A sharp knock at his door startled him. He froze, his mind racing. The knock came again, louder this time. Carter stood slowly, his hand hovering over the holster he had kept even after his suspension. He opened the door a crack, his heart pounding. It was Blake Harwell. "What the hell are you doing here?" Carter asked, his voice low. Blake pushed the door open and stepped inside, his face tense. "You've lost your damn mind, Carter. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Carter scoffed, crossing his arms. "I'm saving myself. You should be thanking me. Barrett's out, and now I'm leveling the playing field." Blake shook his head, his jaw tight. "No, you're sinking everyone, including yourself. Do you really think this is going to end well for you?" Carter stepped closer, his voice rising. "What do you care, Blake? You're the one who gave me the files." "I didn't give you permission to burn the whole damn house down," Blake snapped. "You think the DOJ won't trace this back to you? You think Naomi won't fight back?" Carter's smirk faltered. For the first time, a sliver of doubt crept into his mind. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Get out," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "You're not stopping me." Blake stared at him for a long moment before turning to leave. As he reached the door, he paused. "You've got hours, maybe less, before this all blows up in your face. I hope it's worth it." At City Hall,
Naomi and Reynolds stood in a conference room filled with DOJ officials and legal advisors. The tension was palpable. A large monitor on the wall displayed Carter's leaked email, now circulating online. The accusations against Naomi and Reynolds were bold and inflammatory. "He's desperate," Reynolds said, pacing the room. "This is his last-ditch effort to shift the narrative." Naomi remained calm, her arms crossed. "It won't work. The truth is on our side." One of the officials turned to her. "That may be true, but perception is everything. If we don't counter this quickly, it could undermine everything we've worked for." Naomi's phone buzzed. It was a call from an unknown number. She hesitated before answering. "Ms. Wright," came a voice she recognized immediately. "Carter, what do you want?" Naomi asked, her tone sharp. "A deal," Carter said. "I'll retract everything. I'll disappear. All I want is immunity." Naomi's jaw tightened. "You think you can blackmail your way out of this?" "You've got no choice," Carter replied, his voice smug. "If you come after me, I'll take you down with me. Your reputation, Reynolds, the DOJ. It'll all burn." Naomi paused. Then her voice dropped, icy and deliberate. "Carter, you've underestimated one thing." "And what's that?" Carter asked, his confidence faltering. "The power of the truth," Naomi said before ending the call. Hours later, as the city lights flickered against the night sky, federal agents descended on Carter's apartment. The knock on the door wasn't a warning this time. It was an end. Carter opened the door to find Reynolds and two armed agents standing there. Reynolds held up a document. "Daniel Carter, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and filing false claims against federal officials." Carter's face turned pale as the agents stepped inside. "You can't do this," he shouted. "You have no proof." Reynolds smirked, holding up his phone. "Actually, we do. Thanks for the call. It's all recorded." As Carter was cuffed and led out of his apartment, the city outside remained alive with the energy of change. The protests had grown stronger, and the movement Naomi had ignited was now unstoppable. Naomi watched the arrest unfold on live television from her hotel room. She exhaled deeply, a mix of relief and resolve washing over her. The fight wasn't over, but the tides had turned decisively. I ask you to please comment on your impressions and opinions in the comments. I would feel very happy if you leave me a like.